A cheap dare in a sticky-floored dive bar shouldn't end in a turf war. It should end with a shot of tequila and a burning throat. But when Nora's lips met the unyielding jaw of the man in the corner booth, the jukebox music didn't matter. The air in the room simply died. He didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. He just looked at her with eyes like crushed slate, calculating exactly what her sudden intrusion was going to cost. Thursday nights at the Brass Rail smelled like a cocktail of stale beer, industrial bleach, and exhausted desperation. It was the kind of place where the neon signs buzzed with a low electrical hum that vibrated in your molars, and the bartender stopped wiping down the counter years ago. Nora stared at the damp, peeling cardboard coaster under her glass. She was 28, technically a paralegal, but practically a glorified paperweight for a law firm that billed by the minute and crushed spirits by the hour. Her shoulders ached with a dull, persistent throb. The skin around her fingernails was picked raw. Beside her, Rachel was practically vibrating. Rachel lived her life in all caps, fueled by iced coffees and a terrifying lack of impulse control. Tonight, she was 3 vodka cranberries deep, her breath carrying the sharp, synthetic sweetness of cheap liquor. "You're not even looking," Rachel complained, elbowing Nora's ribs. "I'm looking at my drink," Nora replied, her voice flat. "I'm trying to figure out if the smudge on the rim is lipstick or rust. I'm leaning toward rust. Nora, look at the corner booth." Nora sighed, a heavy, rattling sound that tasted like exhaustion. She dragged her gaze away from the bar, past the worn-out pool table where 2 college kids were arguing over a scratched 8-ball, and toward the back of the room. The corner booth was swallowed in shadow, situated beneath a busted pendant light. But she could see him. He didn't fit. That was the first thing her exhausted brain registered. The Brass Rail was a haven for frayed flannel, scuffed work boots, and slumped postures. The man in the corner sat with a rigid, terrifying stillness. He wore a dark overcoat, the wool thick and undoubtedly expensive, absorbing the ambient light rather than reflecting it. He had a glass of amber liquid in front of him, untouched. He wasn't looking at his phone. He wasn't looking at the erratic sports broadcast on the muted television. He was just looking forward, his face an impassive mask of sharp angles and deep, hollowed shadows. "So?" Nora asked, taking a sip of her gin. It tasted like pine needles and regret. "So," Rachel leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was entirely too loud. "He's been there for an hour. He hasn't blinked. He hasn't moved. I think he's a mannequin they brought in to scare away the rats." "He's just a guy having a bad night, Rach. Leave him alone." "I bet you $50 you won't go kiss him." Nora paused, the rim of her glass hovering just below her lower lip. She turned her head slowly. "What? $50? Cash? Right now?" Rachel slammed a crumpled $50 bill onto the sticky mahogany of the bar. It landed half in a puddle of condensation. "You walk over there, you plant one on him, and you walk back. Easy money." "Are you out of your mind?" Nora stared at the bill, then at her friend. "I'm not assaulting a stranger because you're bored. It's a kiss on the cheek, or the lips if you're feeling spicy." Rachel smirked, a challenge dancing in her slightly unfocused eyes. "Come on, Nora. You've been a ghost for 6 months. You wake up, you go to work. You let those senior partners treat you like a doormat. You go home. You sleep. When was the last time you did something just because?" The words hit harder than Nora wanted to admit. They dug into the soft, bruised parts of her ego. She was a ghost. She felt translucent, entirely detached from her own life. Every day was a masterclass in risk mitigation. "Don't speak out of turn in the meeting. Don't complain about the broken heater in the apartment. Keep your head down. Be invisible." Nora looked back at the man in the corner. He still hadn't moved. He looked like an anchor dropped into the middle of a chaotic ocean, entirely unfazed by the currents swirling around him. A sudden, ugly knot of rebellion tightened in Nora's chest. It wasn't bravery. It was a volatile mixture of severe burnout and the sudden, overwhelming urge to break a rule. Any rule. "You're paying for my cab home too," Nora said, her voice sounding strange and hollow to her own ears. Rachel's eyes widened. "Wait, really?" Nora didn't answer. She pushed off the bar stool. Her boots stuck slightly to the linoleum floor, peeling away with a quiet shh sound with every step. Her heart began to beat against her ribs, a heavy, rhythmic thud that drowned out the muffled bass of the jukebox. "This is stupid," she thought, dodging a waitress carrying a tray of empty pint glasses. "This is aggressively, monumentally stupid," but she didn't stop. The closer she got to the corner booth, the more the atmosphere seemed to thicken. The air grew colder, losing the sweaty humidity of the main bar. She noticed, vaguely, that the two tables immediately adjacent to the corner booth were empty. In a crowded bar on a Thursday, a 10-foot perimeter of empty space was an anomaly she should have questioned. She didn't. She stopped at the edge of his table. Up close, the stillness of him was suffocating. He was older than she was, maybe late 30s, with dark hair cut ruthlessly short on the sides. His jaw was covered in a faint shadow of stubble. He didn't look up when she stopped. He just kept his eyes fixed on the middle distance. Nora's palms were sweating. She wiped them quickly on the denim of her jeans. "Just do it and walk away," she told herself. She leaned forward. The scent hit her first. It wasn't cologne. It was the sharp, clean smell of cold winter air trapped in expensive wool, mingled with a faint metallic tang that reminded her of copper wire and an undercurrent of dry black pepper. It was a harsh, unforgiving scent. She braced one hand on the edge of the wooden table. It was slightly tacky beneath her fingertips. She leaned over his untouched glass of whiskey, closing her eyes as she closed the distance. She aimed for his cheek, a quick, dismissive peck. But at the exact second she moved, he shifted. It wasn't a flinch. It was a micro-adjustment, a predatory turning of the head. Her mouth collided with the corner of his lips and the rough edge of his jawline. The physical contact was jarring. His skin was warm, but the stubble scratched sharply against her softer lower lip. It wasn't a romantic movie moment. It was clumsy, awkward, and tasted vaguely of mint and impending disaster. She pulled back immediately, her heart now hammering a frantic rhythm against her sternum. She opened her mouth to say something, a flippant apology, a joke about a bet, but the words died in her throat. His hand moved faster than her exhausted brain could process. Fingers like iron bands clamped around her left wrist. The grip wasn't painful, but it was absolute. It was the kind of hold that communicated a terrifying physical superiority without breaking a sweat. His thumb pressed perfectly into the pulse point on her wrist. He could feel exactly how terrified she was. Nora gasped, a short, sharp intake of air, and finally looked into his eyes. They were a pale, striking grey, devoid of any warmth or surprise. They were clinical. They dissected her in a fraction of a second. He took in her frayed sweater, the dark circles under her eyes, her pale, terrified face. "Don't move," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp that barely carried over the noise of the bar, yet it commanded absolute authority. Nora froze. She couldn't have moved if she wanted to. The air in her lungs felt trapped. "Who sent you?" he asked, his tone flat, conversational. What? Nora stammered. Her throat was bone dry. The distraction. Who sent you to do it? His thumb pressed infinitesimally harder against her racing pulse. No one, she croaked out, her cynical edge completely evaporating into raw, primal panic. It was a dare, a stupid bet. My friend. She jerked her head slightly back toward the bar. The man, Victor, though she didn't know his name yet, didn't turn his head. He flicked his grey eyes toward the bar, finding Rachel instantly. Rachel was currently leaning over the counter, laughing hysterically, completely oblivious to the fact that Nora's wrist was being held hostage. Victor looked back at Nora. He studied her pupils, the erratic flutter of her breathing. He was searching for deception and finding only genuine, unadulterated stupidity. A heavy, suffocating silence stretched between them for 3 agonizing seconds. Then, slowly, he released her wrist. The sudden absence of his grip made her skin feel cold. Nora took a stumbling step backward, her boot catching on the metal footrest of the booth. "You should leave," Victor said softly. He reached out and picked up his glass of whiskey, finally taking a slow, measured sip. He didn't look at her anymore. It was as if she had ceased to exist. Right now, Nora didn't need to be told twice. She turned on her heel, her legs feeling like wet sand, and speed-walked back to the bar. She grabbed the $50 bill off the wet mahogany and shoved it into her coat pocket, her hands shaking so badly she nearly missed the opening. "Oh my God, your face!" Rachel cackled, slapping the bar. "You actually did it. Was he gross? He looks gross." "We need to go," Nora whispered, grabbing Rachel's arm. Her fingers dug into her friend's sleeve. "What? We just ordered another round." "Rachel, I said we are leaving." Something in Nora's voice, a brittle, fraying edge, finally broke through Rachel's alcohol haze. Rachel blinked, her smile faltering. "Hey, are you okay? Did he say something to you?" I want to go home." Nora turned to signal the bartender for their tab. That was when she noticed the silence. The jukebox was still playing, a tinny rock anthem from the 80s, but the underlying hum of the bar had vanished. The clinking of glasses, the murmur of conversation, the scraping of stools. It had all stopped. Nora looked around. The bartender was standing completely still, a dirty rag clutched tightly in his fist, his eyes fixed on the corner booth. He looked sick, pale, sweating, genuinely sick. The 2 college kids at the pool table had lowered their cues. They were staring at the floor. Nora's stomach performed a slow, sickening roll. She turned her head, tracing the eyeline of everyone in the room. 4 men. They hadn't been there a minute ago, or if they had, Nora had been entirely oblivious to them. 2 were standing by the front door. 1 was leaning against the far wall near the bathrooms. The 4th was standing a few feet away from Victor's booth. They were all dressed in similarly unremarkable, dark clothing. They all stood with their hands resting casually inside the lapels of their jackets. And they were all looking at Nora. The air conditioning kicked on, rattling the exposed vents above, but it did nothing to dispel the sudden claustrophobic heat flushing through Nora's body. She stood frozen by the bar, the sticky floor gripping her soles like a trap. Rachel was still completely unaware. "Nora, you're freaking me out. It was just a joke." Nora didn't look at her. She couldn't take her eyes off the man standing near the corner booth. He was broad-shouldered, with a thick neck and a jagged scar cutting through his left eyebrow. He wasn't looking at Victor. He was looking dead at Nora, waiting for a command. In the booth, Victor set his empty glass down. The sharp clack of the heavy crystal hitting the wood echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. Victor slowly stood up. He was taller than she had realized. When he sat, he had seemed compressed, folded in on himself. Standing, he dominated the space. He smoothed the front of his wool coat with deliberate, unhurried motions. Every movement he made was aggressively normal, yet it radiated an unnatural menace. He stepped out of the booth. The broad-shouldered man instantly stepped back, giving him room, his posture shifting from aggressive to deferential. Nora's breath hitched. A cold, heavy stone dropped into her gut. A boss. She wasn't stupid. She watched the news. She lived in a city where certain names were only spoken in low voices, where entire blocks of real estate were owned by phantom corporations. But that was a world of headlines and rumors. It wasn't supposed to bleed into the brass rail on a random Thursday. Victor walked toward the bar. His footsteps were quiet. The crowd parted for him instinctively, stepping backward, pulling their chairs closer to their tables. No one made eye contact with him. They looked at their drinks, at the floor, at the ceiling. He stopped directly behind Nora. She could smell the cold air and black pepper again, suffocatingly close. The hair on the back of her neck stood up, a primal instinct screaming at her to run, to drop, to do something. But her muscles were locked tight. "Your tab," Victor said. Nora jumped. She turned around, expecting him to be looking at her. He wasn't. He was looking at the terrified bartender, holding out a sleek, matte black credit card. The bartender swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing erratically. It's on the house, Mr. Carmine. Please." Carmine. The name echoed in Nora's head. Victor Carmine, the man who had quietly dismantled 3 rival distribution rings last summer without leaving a single fingerprint. The man the local district attorney had a heart attack trying to indict. Rachel had dared her to kiss Victor Carmine. "I pay for my drinks, David," Victor said. His voice was polite, perfectly modulated. It was the most terrifying sound Nora had ever heard. The bartender scrambled to take the card with trembling fingers, swiping it through the machine so fast he nearly dropped it. Victor finally turned his head and looked down at Nora. Up close, without the shadows of the booth, she could see the exhaustion in his face. He didn't look like a glamorous mobster. He looked like a man carrying an unbearable, crushing weight, utterly bored by the violence of his own life. "I don't like surprises," Victor said quietly. The words were meant only for her. Nora forced herself to meet his gaze. Her hands were still trembling inside her coat pockets, but a strange, cynical detachment began to coat her panic. She had spent her whole life trying to be invisible, trying to be safe, and a $50 dare had undone it all in 5 minutes. "It won't happen again," she managed to say, her voice cracking slightly on the last syllable. "No," Victor agreed softly. "It won't." He took his card back from the bartender, slid it into his coat, and walked toward the exit. The 2 men blocking the door pulled it open for him. The cold night air rushed in, sweeping away the smell of stale beer. Victor stepped out into the night, his men filing out silently behind him. The door swung shut. For 10 seconds, nobody in the bar breathed. Then someone exhaled loudly. The bartender slumped against the back counter, dragging a hand down his face. The college kids at the pool table dropped their cues with a clatter. Rachel grabbed Nora's arm, her fingers digging painfully into the fabric. She was no longer drunk. She was ash white. "Nora," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. "Oh my God. Nora, do you know who that was?" Nora reached into her pocket. Her fingers brushed against the crumpled $50 bill. It felt like dirty money. It felt like a down payment on a disaster she couldn't even begin to comprehend. "Yeah," Nora said, her voice entirely flat. "I do." She stared at the closed wooden door of the bar, feeling the phantom scratch of stubble on her lower lip. The music kicked back in, a loud, obnoxious guitar riff, but for Nora, the silence hadn't ended. It had only just begun. Friday morning arrived not with sunlight, but with the violent, rhythmic clanking of the cast-iron radiator in Nora's bedroom. She woke up with her teeth clamped together, her jaw aching from grinding in her sleep. Her mouth tasted like old pennies and the lingering botanical rot of cheap gin. She lay perfectly still, staring at the water stain on her ceiling that vaguely resembled the continent of Australia. For 10 seconds, the world was normal. She was just a severely underpaid paralegal with a hangover, dreading the morning commute. Then, the memory of the brass rail slammed into her chest like a physical blow. The cold wool of his coat, the sharp, abrasive scratch of stubble against her lip, the terrifying iron-clad grip of his fingers pressing into her pulse point. Victor Carmine. Nora squeezed her eyes shut, rolling onto her side and pulling the thin comforter over her head. She tried to take a deep breath, but her lungs felt shallow, restricted by a tight band of residual panic. It was just a bar, she told herself. A stupid, drunken mistake in a crowded room. Men like him, men who operated in the deep, violent undercurrents of the city, didn't care about exhausted 28-year-olds who lost bets. To him, she was a gnat, a minor, 2-second annoyance, but the logic felt hollow. The memory of his pale grey eyes analysing her, dissecting her panic with clinical precision, refused to fade. "I don't like surprises." She forced herself out of bed. The floorboards were freezing. She went through the mechanics of her morning routine with a hollow, robotic efficiency. Shower, scalding water, scrubbing her skin until it turned a blotchy pink, as if she could wash off the lingering scent of black pepper and winter air. The subway ride to the financial district was an exercise in sensory overload. Usually, Nora tuned out the C train. She could sleep standing up, wedged between briefcases and damp winter coats. Today, every sound was magnified. The screech of metal wheels on the tracks sounded like a scream. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with an aggressive, insect-like hum. She found herself looking at hands. The man reading a newspaper to her left. Were his knuckles scarred? The guy in the black puffer jacket near the doors. Why was he staring at his phone without scrolling? She was building an architecture of paranoia, brick by brick, turning ordinary commuters into phantoms. By the time she reached the offices of Caldwell and Associates, the back of her shirt was damp with cold sweat. The law firm smelled of polished mahogany, expensive toner ink, and the subtle metallic tang of stress. Nora dropped her bag at her desk, which was situated in the bullpen, a windowless stretch of grey cubicles that isolated the paralegals from the senior partners' sun-drenched, glass-walled offices. "You look like a corpse." Nora flinched, nearly knocking over her cold cup of yesterday's coffee. Greg, one of the junior associates, was leaning against her partition. He wore a suit that cost more than her rent, and he always smelled faintly of peppermint and entitlement. "Good morning to you too, Greg," Nora said, keeping her voice flat. She booted up her computer. The blue light washed over her pale face. "Caldwell wants the discovery files for the Hudson Yard zoning dispute formatted and indexed by noon," Greg said, dropping a thick, haphazardly bound stack of manila folders onto her keyboard. A cloud of ancient dust puffed into the air. "Don't mess up the appendices this time. He's in a mood." "He's always in a mood," Nora muttered, pulling the heavy stack toward her. "Just get it done." Greg tapped the desk twice and walked away. Nora stared at the folders. Hudson Yard. Commercial real estate zoning. It was dry, agonizingly tedious work. She spent the next 4 hours submerged in property deeds, shell corporation filings, and municipal tax codes. The mechanical nature of the work should have been a relief, a distraction from the lingering dread in her stomach. Instead, it made it worse. Every time the heavy oak doors of the bullpen clicked open, Nora's shoulders seized. She expected to see a man in a dark overcoat standing in the threshold. Every time her desk phone rang, a sharp, piercing trill, her heart leaped into her throat. She found herself triple-checking the caller ID before answering. By 6 p.m., the office had thinned out. The frenetic energy of the day gave way to the quiet, exhausted hum of the HVAC system. Nora stood up, stretching her spine until it popped. She walked over to the small kitchenette to pour out the dregs of her cold coffee. There was a large window at the end of the hall, overlooking the street 12 stories below. It had started to rain, a freezing, miserable drizzle that slicked the pavement black. Nora stood by the glass, looking down at the slow crawl of traffic. The streetlights bled into blurry halos against the wet asphalt. Across the street, parked aggressively in a loading zone, was a matte black Lincoln Town car. The engine was running. She could see the faint wisp of white exhaust curling into the damp air. The windows were tinted too dark to see inside. Nora's breath hitched, fogging the glass in front of her. It was just a car. Half the executives in this building used private black car services. It meant nothing. But as she watched, the driver's side window rolled down exactly 2 inches. A hand extended into the rain. A cigarette glowed orange in the gloom. The smoker flicked the ash and the window rolled back up, sealing the car off from the world again. Nora backed away from the window, her pulse hammering in her ears. She practically ran back to her desk, shoved her files into a drawer, grabbed her coat, and left without clocking out. She took the stairs down to the lobby, avoiding the elevator. She didn't want to be trapped in a metal box. She didn't want to be trapped anywhere. The weekend offered no sanctuary. By Sunday afternoon, the paranoia had settled deep into Nora's bones, transforming from sharp spikes of panic into a dull, unrelenting ache. She felt brittle, as though a sudden noise could shatter her into 1,000 pieces. She hadn't heard from Rachel. She hadn't reached out. She couldn't stomach the thought of trying to explain the suffocating weight in her chest to someone who thought the entire incident was a hilarious anecdote. At 2 p.m., the pile of dirty clothes overflowing from her hamper forced her out of her apartment. The neighborhood laundromat was 3 blocks down, situated between a defunct hardware store and a 24-hour bodega that smelled aggressively of fried plantains and floor wax. The laundromat itself was a humid, sensory nightmare. The air was thick with the suffocating scent of artificial lavender detergent and damp lint. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered rhythmically, casting an institutional pallor over the row of dented washing machines. Nora claimed a corner machine. She dumped her clothes in, mechanically sorting the darks from the lights. The mindless physical labor was grounding. She watched the water pour over her frayed sweaters and cheap jeans through the scratched plastic window of the washer, the suds rising in a slow, suffocating foam. There were only 2 other people in the laundromat, an elderly woman aggressively folding bedsheets and a teenager with headphones clamped over his ears, staring blankly at his phone. Nora sat on a cracked plastic chair, resting her elbows on her knees, burying her face in her hands. She was so tired, the kind of tired that sleep couldn't fix, the kind of tired that lived in the marrow. The bell above the glass door chimed, a cheerful, tinny sound that cut through the low rumble of the spinning machines. A gust of freezing street air swept into the humid room. Nora didn't look up immediately. She kept her eyes on the scuffed linoleum floor, watching a stray clump of dust skitter across the tiles. But then she heard the footsteps, heavy, measured, the sound of rubber-soled boots hitting the floor with absolute, quiet purpose. The footsteps stopped directly to her left, near the adjacent folding table. Nora slowly raised her head. It was the man with the scar, the broad-shouldered man from the brass rail, the one who had stood silently by the corner booth, waiting for Victor Carmine's command. Up close, the scar cutting through his left eyebrow was jagged and pale, pulling the skin tight and giving his eye a permanent, cynical droop. He was wearing a dark brown leather jacket over a black Henley. He didn't look like a mob enforcer out of a movie. He looked like an off-duty mechanic. That made it infinitely worse. The oxygen vanished from Nora's lungs. Her muscles locked instantly, preparing for violence, preparing to bolt, but her body remained frozen to the plastic chair. The scarred man didn't reach into his jacket. He didn't pull a weapon. He didn't even look at her directly. He placed a plastic grocery bag onto the folding table. The elderly woman, a few machines down, continued folding her sheets, completely oblivious. The teenager's head continued to bob to his silent music. The man reached into his plastic bag and pulled out a bottle of bleach. He set it on the table. Then he turned his head slowly, his gaze landing on Nora. His eyes were dark, flat, and completely devoid of empathy. "You dropped something the other night?" he said. His voice was gravelly, quiet enough that it barely carried over the sloshing water in the machines. Nora couldn't speak. Her throat had closed up entirely. The man reached into the pocket of his leather jacket. Nora flinched, bracing herself, her hands gripping the edges of her plastic chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. He pulled out a crumpled $50 bill. He reached over and placed it precisely on top of Nora's faded canvas laundry bag, resting on the chair next to her. The paper made a soft, crisp sound against the fabric. Nora stared at the bill. It was the same one. She had put it in her coat pocket. She had felt it there. They must have followed her. Or worse, someone had been in her apartment. The violation of it was so absolute, so quietly devastating, that bile rose in the back of her throat. "Mr. Carmine appreciates discretion, Miss Gallagher," the man said softly. Miss Gallagher. He knew her last name. "He doesn't like loose ends," the man continued, his tone conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. "And he doesn't like variables. Go to work, go home, keep your head down. Do we understand each other?" Nora forced herself to look up from the money. She met his dead, dark eyes. She wanted to scream. She wanted to yell for the teenager to call the police. But the cynical, pragmatic part of her brain, the part that had kept her surviving in this city for years, knew that screaming would only accelerate the danger. She gave a single, jerky nod. "Good," the man said. He didn't take the bottle of bleach. He simply turned around, walked to the glass door, and stepped back out into the freezing afternoon. The bell chimed cheerfully as the door swung shut. Nora sat frozen for a full minute, staring at the empty space where he had stood. The rhythmic thumping of the washing machines suddenly sounded like a heartbeat, heavy, erratic, and terrified. She looked down at the $50 bill resting on her laundry bag. It looked radioactive. Her hands were shaking so violently she had to interlock her fingers to stop them. She wasn't invisible anymore. The shadows of the city had noticed her, and they had reached out to touch her. The realization was a cold, heavy stone dropping into the pit of her stomach. She hadn't just kissed a stranger. She had tied a thread between herself and a predator, and now they were slowly, methodically pulling it taut, By Monday morning, the fear had crystallized into something sharper, something far more dangerous, a desperate, clawing need to understand the trap she was in. Nora arrived at the law firm an hour early. The bullpen was silent, bathed in the sickly green glow of the emergency exit signs. She didn't turn on the overhead lights. She sat at her desk, the glow of her monitor illuminating her pale face and the dark, bruised rings under her eyes. Go to work. Go home. Keep your head down. The scarred man's words echoed in her skull. It was a clear directive, a warning. But sitting passively, waiting for the axe to fall, went against every cynical survival instinct she possessed. If Victor Carmine knew who she was, knew where she lived, knew her name, she needed to know why she was a variable. She wasn't a threat. She was a paralegal. It didn't make sense to waste resources intimidating her over a spilled drink and a drunken kiss. Unless she wasn't just a random girl in a bar, Nora opened the firm's secure internal database. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Looking up a client was one thing. Looking up a known, organized crime figure on the firm's servers was entirely different. It left a digital footprint. It was reckless. She typed it anyway. Carmine. Victor. The search engine churned for 3 agonizing seconds. The little loading icon spun, mocking her hesitation. 0 direct results. She exhaled a shaky breath. Of course not. Men like him didn't own things in their own names. They owned the companies that owned the holding groups, that owned the LLCs. She thought back to her work on Friday, the Hudson Yard zoning dispute. Caldwell had been frantic about it. The firm was representing a massive corporate developer, Vanguard Holdings, trying to push through a rezoning permit that would bulldoze 3 blocks of old industrial warehouses near the docks. Nora cross-referenced the properties scheduled for demolition. She pulled up the municipal tax records for the warehouses. Owner, Ironclad Logistics, LLC. Owner, Apex Shipping and Storage. Owner, North River Holdings. She dug deeper, tracing the LLCs through the state registry. It was a maze of dummy corporations and blind trusts. But after 40 minutes of frantic clicking, her eyes burning from the screen glare, she found the common denominator. All 3 shell companies shared the same registered agent address, a tiny, unremarkable P.O. box in a strip mall in Queens. Nora pulled up the state's corporate registry database and searched the P.O. box. A list of 20 different companies populated the screen. Waste management, construction, vending machine distribution, and there, buried in the middle, a name she recognized from a news article she had read months ago. VC Enterprises, Victor Carmine. The air left her lungs in a rush. She pushed her rolling chair back, the wheels catching on the cheap industrial carpet. Caldwell wasn't just representing a developer. Caldwell was actively trying to legally seize and bulldoze territory owned by Victor Carmine's front companies. The firm she worked for was locked in a multi-million-dollar war with the man she had kissed in a dive bar. She wasn't a random girl. To Carmine, she was an employee of the enemy who had walked straight up to him and made physical contact. He didn't think it was a drunken dare. He thought it was a message, or a scouting mission. I don't like surprises. She was the surprise. And she had walked right into his lap. The rest of the workday was a blur of pure, unadulterated terror. Nora felt like she was moving underwater. Every time Caldwell yelled from his office, every time the phone rang, she flinched. She kept waiting for the doors to burst open. She kept waiting for the black car to pull up. By 8 p.m., she couldn't take the suffocating atmosphere of the office anymore. She needed air. She needed to be somewhere brightly lit, somewhere public. She packed her bag, ignoring the stack of unfiled documents on her desk, and practically ran to the elevator. Outside, the temperature had plummeted. The wind ripped down the avenues, cutting through her thin wool coat like a knife. She walked blindly, her head down, her hands shoved deep into her pockets. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't go back to her empty, quiet apartment. 3 blocks from the firm, she saw the neon glow of a 24-hour diner. The sign flickered red, buzzing with a comforting electrical warmth. She pushed through the heavy glass doors. The diner smelled of burnt coffee, industrial floor cleaner, and stale grease. It was aggressively bright. Fluorescent lights reflected off the cracked vinyl booths and the stainless steel counter. A waitress behind the register was aggressively chewing gum and reading a tabloid. A few scattered patrons sat alone, nursing mugs of coffee. Nora slid into a booth in the back, facing the door. Her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her teeth. "Coffee," she told the waitress when she approached. "Just a lot of it." The waitress nodded, sliding a thick ceramic mug onto the table and filling it with dark, sludgy liquid. Nora wrapped her cold, trembling hands around the hot ceramic, letting the heat seep into her skin. She stared at the swirling black surface of the coffee, trying to force her brain to slow down, to formulate a plan. Quit her job, move to a different borough, change her name. Everything felt dramatic, yet entirely necessary. The little brass bell above the diner door jingled. Nora looked up instantly, a pure reflex. Victor Carmine walked in. He was alone. No scarred henchman, no silent guards by the door. Just him. He wore the same dark, heavy overcoat, his presence absorbing the harsh fluorescent light of the diner. He looked entirely out of place among the cracked vinyl and sticky linoleum. He didn't scan the room. He didn't look at the waitress. His grey eyes locked onto Nora the second he stepped through the door. The diner suddenly felt entirely devoid of oxygen. The background noise, the clatter of silverware, the hum of the refrigerators, vanished into a low, static hiss in Nora's ears. He walked slowly, deliberately, toward her booth. Every survival instinct screamed at her to slide out, to run past him, to scream for help. But the sheer gravitational pull of his presence pinned her to the vinyl seat. She watched him approach with the morbid fascination of a bird watching a snake. Victor stopped at her table. He looked down at her, his expression utterly unreadable, a mask of sharp angles and shadow. Without asking, he unbuttoned his overcoat and slid into the booth across from her. The scent of cold winter air and sharp black pepper instantly overpowered the smell of stale grease. He sat perfectly still, his large hands resting flat on the scuffed formica table. For a long, agonizing minute, neither of them spoke. The waitress walked by, stopping abruptly when she noticed him. "Can I get you something, hon?" she asked, her voice faltering slightly as she took in his expensive clothes and the terrifying stillness of his posture. "Black coffee," Victor said, not taking his eyes off Nora. His voice was a low, rough rasp. "Leave the pot." The waitress practically ran to fetch it. Nora stared at him. Up close, in the harsh, unforgiving light of the diner, he looked exhausted. There were deep, bruised shadows under his eyes, and the stubble on his jaw was slightly thicker than it had been on Thursday night. Yet the exhaustion didn't diminish his danger. It made him look like a machine running perfectly on fumes, incapable of stopping. The waitress returned, hands shaking, deposited the pot and a mug, and vanished. Victor poured himself a cup. He took a slow sip. "You have a terrible poker face, Miss Gallagher," he said quietly. The sound of her name on his lips sent a violent shiver down her spine. "How did you find me?" she whispered. Her voice sounded brittle, thin as spun glass. "You work 3 blocks away," he replied simply. "And you have a habit of looking over your shoulder. Are you going to kill me?" The words tumbled out before she could stop them, raw and entirely unfiltered. It wasn't bravery, it was the absolute limit of her cynical endurance snapping. Victor paused. He lowered his mug, the ceramic clinking softly against the table. He tilted his head slightly, studying her with those pale, analytical eyes. He took in her trembling hands, the rapid rise and fall of her chest, the sheer, unadulterated terror radiating from her pores. "If I wanted you dead," Victor said, his voice entirely devoid of malice, a simple statement of fact, "you wouldn't have made it to the laundromat." Nora flinched at the confirmation. "Then what do you want?" she asked, her voice cracking. Victor leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. The space between them shrank, the air growing thick and electrically charged. "You logged into your firm's database at 6:42 this morning," Victor said softly. "You spent 40 minutes cross-referencing Vanguard holdings with 3 of my supply warehouses. You are a paralegal for Robert Caldwell, the man currently trying to bankrupt me through municipal zoning litigation." Nora's stomach plummeted. He knew exactly what she had done. He was watching the servers. "It was a dare," Nora said, her voice shaking violently. "At the bar, it was a stupid $50 dare from my friend. I didn't know who you were. I didn't know about Vanguard, I swear to God." Victor looked at her lips. A fleeting, almost imperceptible shadow passed over his features, a memory of the collision. "I believe you," he said quietly. Nora blinked, thrown off balance. You do?" "Yes." His gaze drifted back up to her eyes, locking her in place. "Because no one I am at war with is stupid enough to send a terrified, underpaid paralegal to kiss me in a public place as a warning." The blunt insult stung, cutting through her fear for a fraction of a second. "Then why follow me? Why send your guy to my laundromat?" "Because," Victor said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a weight that made the hair on Nora's arms stand up. "You are now a variable in an equation that I control. You work for my enemy. You put your hands on me. You connected the dots this morning, which means, Miss Gallagher, you are no longer invisible." He leaned back against the vinyl booth, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked like a king assessing a severely damaged pawn. "And I don't like variables," he finished. "So we are going to fix that." Nora stared at the space between them on the scratched Formica table. The fluorescent lights hummed, casting a sickly yellow pallor over the diner, but Victor seemed entirely untouched by it. "Fix it," Nora repeated. The words felt thick on her tongue. "How exactly do you fix a variable?" Victor reached into the inner pocket of his overcoat. The movement was smooth, entirely devoid of the aggressive posturing his men displayed. He withdrew a small, cheap plastic cell phone, a burner still encased in its clear plastic packaging, and set it on the table. He didn't slide it toward her, he just left it resting next to the aluminum napkin dispenser. "Robert Caldwell is a parasite," Victor said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "He doesn't fight zoning wars in court. He fights them in back rooms. He bribes municipal inspectors to find asbestos where there isn't any. He blackmails city councilmen. I know this, and he knows I know it, but I don't have his paper trail." Nora's eyes flicked from the cheap phone to Victor's face. "And you think I do?" "You are the paralegal formatting his discovery files," Victor said. "You have network access. You know his filing system. You know what he hides and where he hides it." The diner suddenly felt dangerously hot. The cheap synthetic fabric of Nora's sweater clung damply to her skin. She understood exactly what he was asking. It wasn't a request. It was a trade. Her life for her treason. "You want me to steal his internal files," she whispered. "I want you to download the unredacted communications between Caldwell and Vanguard Holdings from the last 6 months. Specifically his emails with Alderman Davies. I want them on a flash drive." Victor picked up his coffee mug, taking a slow sip. He watched her over the ceramic rim. "You deliver that, and the thread between us is cut. You go back to being entirely invisible. I never look your way again." Nora's hands trembled. She shoved them under her thighs, pressing them flat against the vinyl seat to force them to stop. "And if I don't? If I go to the police?" "You won't. You don't know me." "I know exactly who you are, Nora." Hearing her first name in his voice, that gravelly, exhausted baritone, made her stomach hollow out. "You are 28 years old," Victor continued, his tone devoid of cruelty, merely reciting facts. "You have $42,000 in student debt. You haven't taken a vacation in 3 years. You hate your boss, you hate your apartment, and you tolerate your friends. You survive. You don't live. Going to the police requires a belief that the system works. You work for Caldwell. You know better than anyone that the system only works for the man with the most leverage. The absolute accuracy of his assessment felt like a physical violation. He had dismantled her entire existence in 3 sentences. The worst part wasn't that he had investigated her. The worst part was that he was right. She looked at the plastic phone. The barcode on the back was slightly torn. If she did this, she was crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Corporate espionage. Theft. Aiding a known criminal syndicate. The legal consequences were catastrophic, but looking at the man sitting across from her, the legal consequences felt like a distant, abstract concept. The immediate reality was Victor Carmine's pale, dissecting gaze. "When do you need it?" Nora asked. Her voice was flat, defeated. A microscopic shift occurred in Victor's posture. It wasn't relief. It was the quiet settling of a trap snapping shut. "Friday," he said. "The injunction hearing is Monday. I need time to process the data. You take the phone. When you have the drive, you turn it on. It only has one contact. You call it, and I tell you where to bring it." He stood up. The diner seemed to expand as he stepped out of the booth, the oppressive weight of his proximity lifting slightly. He buttoned his overcoat. "Do not try to read the files, Nora," he said, looking down at her. "Just copy them. Ignorance is the best armor you can wear right now." He didn't wait for a reply. He turned and walked out of the diner. The bell jingled. The cold air rushed in. Nora sat in the booth for a long time. The coffee in front of her grew cold, a slick film forming over the black surface. She slowly reached out, her fingers brushing the cold plastic packaging of the burner phone. She picked it up. It weighed almost nothing, but as she dropped it into her coat pocket, it felt like it was dragging her straight down into the concrete. Tuesday through Thursday tasted like copper and battery acid. Nora existed in a state of suspended animation. She went to the office. She drank the bitter break-room coffee. She listened to Greg complain about his dry cleaner. The mundanity of her environment was a jarring contrast to the violent, high-stakes panic boiling in her gut. Every time Caldwell walked past her desk, trailing the smell of expensive cologne and stale cigar smoke, Nora felt a spike of adrenaline so sharp it made her vision blur. She needed to get into Caldwell's personal server cache. It wasn't impossible, but it was incredibly risky. The firm's IT department flagged mass downloads. She couldn't just rip the entire hard drive. She had to surgically extract the exact emails Victor wanted. By Thursday evening, the bullpen was mostly empty. The overhead fluorescents hummed their usual migraine-inducing tune. Nora sat at her desk, her knuckles white as she gripped her mouse. Caldwell had left for a dinner meeting at 7. His office door was locked, but his network partition wasn't air-gapped from the senior paralegal access tier. She typed in the administrative bypass code she had watched Greg use a dozen times. Access granted. Her breath hitched. She clicked into the folder labeled Vanguard_Hudson_internal. The files populated, hundreds of them. She searched the keyword Davies. The screen filtered down to 12 email chains and 4 PDF attachments. She opened the first one. She wasn't supposed to read them. Victor had explicitly told her not to, but the cynical, self-destructive part of her brain couldn't stop her eyes from scanning the text. It was an itemized list of campaign contributions, funneled through 3 different political action committees, attached to an email from Caldwell outlining exactly which safety inspectors Davies needed to fire to clear Vanguard's demolition path. It was a blueprint for municipal corruption. It was disgusting. A sudden, unexpected spike of vindication pierced through Nora's terror. She wasn't just saving her own skin. She was burning down Caldwell's rotten empire. She jammed a blank black thumb drive into the USB port. The computer chimed softly. She highlighted the files. Drag. Drop. A progress bar appeared, copying 16 items. Time remaining. 45 seconds. 45 seconds felt like an eternity. The fan on her desktop tower whirred, sounding deafening in the quiet office. A bead of cold sweat rolled down her spine, pooling at the waistband of her skirt. 30 seconds. She heard the heavy oak doors of the bullpen click open. Nora froze. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She didn't turn around. She kept her eyes locked on the screen. 15 seconds. Nora, you're still here. It was Greg. His voice was slightly slurred. He had clearly been at the happy hour down the street. Just finishing up, Nora said. Her voice sounded astonishingly steady, a complete contradiction to the violent trembling in her legs. 5 seconds. Greg walked down the aisle, his leather shoes squeaking on the cheap carpet. He stopped at her cubicle wall. You work too hard. Caldwell doesn't care. Come get a drink. Transfer complete. Nora immediately closed the window, right-clicked the USB icon, and hit eject. She casually pulled the drive out and dropped it into her lap, masking the movement by shifting her chair. I'm exhausted, Greg. Rain check, she said, finally turning to look at him. She forced a tired, authentic-looking smile. Greg shrugged, entirely oblivious. Suit yourself. He wandered off toward his desk. Nora didn't wait. She grabbed her coat, shoved the drive into the lining pocket, and practically sprinted to the elevator. 30 minutes later, she was standing under the awning of a closed dry cleaner in Chelsea. The rain had started again, a relentless, freezing downpour that turned the city streets into slick, black mirrors. She reached into her pocket with numb fingers, pulled out the cheap burner phone, and held down the power button. The screen lit up with a harsh, bright glare. She dialed the only number saved in the contacts. It rang once. Where are you? Victor's voice was a low rumble of static in her ear. Corner of 23rd and 8th, she said, her teeth chattering. I have it. Walk south. 2 blocks. Get in the Blacktown car. The line clicked dead. She shoved the phone back into her pocket and stepped out into the freezing rain. By the time she reached 21st Street, her coat was soaked through. The Lincoln was idling near a fire hydrant. The back door opened from the inside as she approached. Nora climbed in, slamming the heavy door shut behind her. The interior was a sanctuary of heat and the thick, rich smell of expensive leather. The rain drummed a heavy, muffled rhythm against the roof. The glass partition between the front and back seats was raised, heavily tinted. They were entirely isolated. Victor sat on the far side of the plush leather bench. He was in a charcoal suit tonight, no overcoat, the tie loosened slightly at his throat. The exhaustion she had seen in the diner was still there, but beneath it thrummed a coiled, predatory energy. He held out his hand. Nora reached into her pocket. Her fingers were stiff with cold. She pulled out the black thumb drive and placed it into his palm. His skin was warm. The brief point of contact sent a jolt up her arm. Victor didn't look at the drive. He kept his eyes on her. She was shivering violently, her wet hair plastered to her cheeks, her breathing shallow and ragged. "You read them," he said quietly. "It wasn't a question." Nora swallowed hard. "I saw enough. Caldwell owns Davies." Victor pocketed the drive. He leaned back slightly, studying the erratic, terrified pulse fluttering at the base of her throat. "I told you not to look," he murmured. "It doesn't matter," Nora snapped, a sudden, jagged edge of defiance breaking through her fear. "You have what you want. We're done. Cut the thread." Victor didn't move. The silence in the car grew thick, heavy with the hum of the heater and the smell of ozone from the storm outside. He reached out, his movements slow, deliberate. Nora braced herself, her breath catching, expecting violence, expecting his iron grip. Instead, he touched her face. His thumb brushed the damp hair off her cheek, tucking it behind her ear. The touch was completely incongruous with the man he was. It was firm, yet entirely gentle. His knuckles grazed her jawline, the exact spot his stubble had scratched her days ago. Nora froze. Her heart stopped hammering and simply seized. The physical proximity was overwhelming. She could smell his skin, the dark pepper and clean soap. She looked into his pale grey eyes and saw the terrible, terrifying truth. The thread wasn't cut. "I underestimated you," Victor said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. His thumb lingered on her jaw. "You aren't just a variable, Nora. You're a survivor, and survivors don't belong in the background." He dropped his hand. The sudden absence of his touch felt like the temperature in the car plummeted 10 degrees. "The driver will take you home," Victor said, his tone shifting back to the clinical, detached boss. "Pack a bag. Enough for 3 days." Panic, hot and sharp, spiked in her chest. "What? Why? We had a deal. I gave you the files." "Because," Victor said, looking away from her, staring out the rain-slicked window. "By tomorrow morning, Robert Caldwell is going to know his servers were breached. And when he checks the security logs, he is going to find your administrative bypass code. He won't fire you. He will send his private fixers to your apartment to find out who you sold him to." Nora felt the blood drain from her face. She had used Greg's code, but her terminal ID was stamped on the login. She had been so panicked about the physical act of stealing the files, she hadn't thought about the digital forensics. "You knew," she breathed, horror washing over her. "You knew I'd leave a trail." "I knew it was highly probable," Victor corrected smoothly. "Which is why you're going to pack a bag. My men will pick you up in an hour. You're going to stay in one of my properties until I dismantle Caldwell completely." "You're kidnapping me." Victor finally turned back to look at her. His eyes were hard, stripping away any illusion of gentleness. "I am keeping you alive. You crossed the line the second you plugged that drive in. There is no going back to being invisible. Accept it." The safe house was a penthouse in Tribeca, austere and completely devoid of personal touches. It smelled faintly of lemon polish and expensive, unused air. Nora spent 48 hours pacing the hardwood floors, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling grid of the city. She was a prisoner. She had a fully stocked fridge, a massive television she didn't turn on, and a heavy steel door that was locked from the outside. The scarred man, Leo, she had learned his name when he picked her up, stood in the hallway. She should have been terrified. She should have been weeping. But as she stood by the glass on Saturday night, watching the taillights bleed red down the West Side Highway, Nora realized something entirely unsettling. She wasn't scared, not anymore. The chronic, soul-crushing anxiety that had defined her life for 5 years was gone. It had been replaced by a sharp, hyper-vigilant clarity. She had burned her life down. Caldwell was likely hunting her. The police might be looking for her. But standing in a mafia boss's glass cage, Nora felt a terrifying, electric sense of agency. She had finally made a choice, even if it was a catastrophic one. At 11 p.m., the heavy deadbolt on the front door clacked loudly. Nora turned from the window. Victor walked in. He looked like he had been through a war. His suit jacket was gone. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar. The sleeves rolled up to expose forearms corded with tension and a dark, blooming bruise on his left wrist. He smelled of cold air, exhaustion, and a faint metallic scent that Nora instantly recognized as dried blood. He didn't look at her immediately. He walked straight to the kitchen island, leaned his hands flat on the marble counter, and let his head drop, exhaling a long, jagged breath. Nora walked slowly toward him. Her bare feet made no sound on the hardwood. "Is it done?" she asked softly. Victor raised his head. His eyes met hers. They were bloodshot, the grey almost entirely swallowed by dilated pupils. "Davies resigned this afternoon," Victor said, his voice completely raw. "Federal prosecutors raided Vanguard Holdings at 6 o'clock. Caldwell's firm is currently being dismantled by the SEC for securities fraud and extortion." Nora's breath caught in her throat. He hadn't just used the files to win a zoning dispute. He had used them to orchestrate a complete, structural collapse of his enemies. "And Caldwell?" she asked. Victor's jaw tightened. "Caldwell tried to send 2 men to your apartment yesterday morning. Leo intercepted them. Caldwell is currently in police custody. He won't be a problem." The implications hit her like a physical weight. Leo intercepted them. If Victor hadn't pulled her out, she would have been there. "Why did you do it?" Nora asked, stepping closer. The distance between them was less than 3 feet now. "You could have just used the files for your warehouses. You didn't need to burn the whole firm down." "He sent men to your home," Victor said flatly. "I was a variable," she challenged, her voice rising slightly. "I was a loose end. You got what you wanted. You didn't have to protect me." Victor turned fully to face her. The sheer physical gravity of him pulled at her, dangerous and undeniable. The exhaustion in his face stripped away the polished, untouchable veneer of the boss she had met in the diner. He looked human, violent, ruthless, but undeniably human. "I told you," he murmured, taking a slow step toward her. "I don't like variables. I secure them." He reached out. This time, there was no hesitation. His large hand wrapped around the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in the hair at the base of her skull. The grip was firm, possessive, a direct echo of the man who had grabbed her wrist in the bar. But the intent was entirely different. Nora gasped, her hands instinctively coming up to press against his chest. She could feel the heavy, rapid thud of his heart through the fabric of his shirt. He didn't force her closer. He just held her there, anchored to him, letting the tensions stretch until it felt like the air between them might shatter. "You don't have a job anymore," Victor said, his voice a low, rough rumble vibrating against her collarbone. "You don't have an apartment you can safely return to. The ghost you were playing is dead. What am I supposed to do?" she whispered, staring up into those pale, relentless eyes. She wasn't asking for permission. She was asking for the truth. Victor stepped into her space, eliminating the last few inches between them. The heat radiating off him was overwhelming. "You adapt," he said. His gaze dropped to her lips. "You stepped into my world on a dare, Nora. But you're staying because you realize you prefer the dark to the cubicle." He didn't wait for her to agree. He tilted his head and kissed her. It wasn't like the collision at the bar. There was no clumsiness, no accident. It was deliberate, heavy, and consuming. His mouth was hard and demanding, tasting of black coffee and adrenaline. Nora's cynical, rational mind screamed at her to pull away, to run from the burning building. But her hands, entirely of their own volition, curled into the fabric of his shirt, pulling him closer. She kissed him back, pouring every ounce of her exhausted, terrifying week into it. It was raw. It was imperfect. It was the desperate clinging of two people who understood exactly how brutal the world was. When he finally broke the kiss, he didn't let her go. He rested his forehead against hers, his breathing heavy, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. Nora kept her eyes closed, listening to the hum of the city through the thick glass of the penthouse. She had lost her quiet, miserable life. She had traded it for a tether to a man who owned the shadows. She opened her eyes, looking at the bruised, exhausted face of Victor Carmine. She wasn't invisible anymore, and God help her, she didn't want to be. Nora thought she was making a reckless choice for $50, but she ended up trading her soul-crushing 9-to-5 for a seat at the table of a criminal empire. Did she make the right call, or did she just trade one cage for a more dangerous one? Hit the like button if you loved this raw, gritty dive into the shadows. Share this with anyone who craves a romance with real stakes and real consequences. Make sure to subscribe so you never miss our next dark, character-driven story. Tell us in the comments, would you have taken the burner phone?